Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're taking a really critical look into what the term crimes actually means when we talk about American history using the sources you provided. Our mission here is to unpack some of those large-scale systemic injustices. We're talking about profound human rights violations, often perpetrated or even sanctioned by the state itself. We've focused on three key examples, really because of their deep and lasting impact. So let's get into it for you.
Right. And what your sources really drive home is that these events, they're not just footnotes in a history book. They fundamentally shaped the nation. And we're still feeling the ripple effects today. What's really crucial to grasp, is that these acts, these crimes, were often perfectly legal back then, which, when you think about it, points to a huge moral and, frankly, legal failing in the system itself.
Absolutely. So, first on the list, chattel slavery. The sources we looked at paint this picture of a meticulously built system. It's about dehumanization, ownership, all designed for economic gain, especially making slavery hereditary. What did the research really pinpoint about, say, the economic necessity aspect?
Well, the sources really hammer home how those legal codes, the ones defining children born to enslaved mothers as property, how absolutely central they were. This wasn't just about power. It was, quite chillingly, an economic strategy. You create a labor force that replenishes itself. Especially vital after the cotton gin invention drastically increased the demand for labor, right?
Yeah, makes sense.
And this systematic extraction of wealth, of labor, it didn't just stop in 1865. The sources show how Jim Crow laws kept it going. Things like segregation, sharecropping, and something called convict leasing.
Convict leasing. Tell us a bit more about how the sources describe that.
Yeah, it was basically a loophole. It allowed states to lease out prisoners, overwhelmingly black men, for really brutal forced labor. So it was effectively re-enslavement, just under a different legal cover, all for profit. And you can trace lines from that, to the racial wealth gap today, to disparities in the justice system.
That's a really powerful connection, showing how these things aren't really past, are they? And tragically, there's another huge injustice the sources illuminate. The catastrophic impact on indigenous peoples.
Yeah.
The population drop is just staggering, like estimates of over 10 million people down to maybe under 300,000 by 1900. When the sources talk about genocidal policies, what specifics really stand out?
They point to direct violence, things like actual bounties paid for Native people, and documented cases of biological warfare, like distributing blankets infected with smallpox, knowingly.
It's horrifying.
It is. And then you have policies like the Indian Removal Act of 1830 and the Trail of Tears, 1838-39, that followed. Just devastating. Your sources really expose the hypocrisy, too. All this talk of civilization, of progress, used to justify stealing land and destroying cultures. And also the forced assimilation, The boarding schools like Carlisle with that infamous motto, kill the Indian in him and save the man. It led to huge losses of language, identity.
So we've seen these two massive century-spanning injustices. But looking through your sources, it's, striking how a pattern seems to pop up again later. Let's fast forward to World War II. Executive Order 9066 in 1942. This forced over 120,000 Japanese Americans, and remember, 75,000 were U.S. citizens out of their homes and into incarceration camps. What did the sources suggest about maybe a recurring theme here, about how civil liberties fare in times of crisis?
Yeah, the sources are clear. There was absolutely no evidence of disloyalty from this community. None. It was driven by wartime fear, yes, but also, crucially, by pre-existing racism. And it really shows how fragile civil liberties can become when there's a perceived crisis. The government chose what it saw as safety over constitutional rights, even when its own intelligence reports didn't back up the threat narrative.
As the Supreme Court played a role.
It did. The Korematsu v. United States decision in 1944 upheld the government's actions. It's widely criticized now, seen as a real low point for the court. But importantly, your sources also cover the redress movement much later on. This led to a formal apology from the government and reparations through the Civil Liberties Act of 1988. So you see this later attempt at acknowledging the injustice, a kind of reckoning.
Right. So tying this all together for you, the listener, what can we take away? These really distinct events, slavery, the dispossession of indigenous peoples, the Japanese-American incarceration, they seem connected by some deep, troubling themes, right? Pervasive racial prejudice, economic exploitation as a driver, and the really dangerous misuse of government power. often
Yeah.
masked by words like progress or national security.
Exactly. And drawing these threads together, understanding these historical roots, it's not just about looking back. It's vital for tackling today's issues. Things like mass incarceration, environmental racism, fights over voting rights. These things have deep roots in the history we've just touched on. Confronting these difficult truths, uncomfortable as they are, it's really the essential first step. It's how we start making those foundational promises, freedom, democracy, equality, truly real for everyone.